Hello everyone, and welcome to Reuters Events' latest webinar, Bridging the Gap, Earn Patients' Trust Post-Pandemic to Improve Health Outcomes. We're going to begin in just a moment. We're going to give it a minute to allow as much of our audience to join in live. I can see a number of you coming in right now, so just bear with us for a second and then we will jump right into the discussion. Hello everyone, and again thank you for joining us for our latest webinar, Bridging the Gap, Earn Patients Trust Post-Pandemic to Improve Health Outcomes, where we are going to discuss how to transform your patient engagement approach across the life cycle by better reflecting the holistic needs, preferences, and values of the patient. I'm Matt Atkinson, a global project director at Reuters Events Pharma, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator today. Just before we begin, a little couple of bits of housekeeping. We will be sending the recording next Monday, so please look out for that if you'd like to watch again or share with colleagues. And again, this is an interactive webinar, so we're going to have poll questions. We're going to be looking for questions from you, so please engage throughout and we'll be able to get to those points as we go through. So as we know, the healthcare system has been going through many changes and challenges driven by COVID-19. More specifically, the pharmaceutical industry has faced various challenges in both R&D and commercial, and has been rapidly developing, testing and delivering new vaccines in record time. And while we may expect that all the efforts made will result in positive recognition for pharma and increase patient trust in the industry, we're still witnessing the lack of trust as a core issue influencing the decisions and actions that patients take. This deep-seated mistrust not only affects patients' perceptions of pharma, but it also affects their healthcare decisions, as evidenced by a significant portion of the population choosing not to get the COVID-19 vaccine out of mistrust. So in today's discussion, we'd like to take a deeper dive into some of the underlying causes of the patient trust gap, and hear our panelists' thoughts on ways to remediate the issues that can enhance trust and patient engagement to intimately improve health outcomes. And with that, I would like the panelists to introduce themselves. Sarah, if I can start with you, please.
Good morning, or good afternoon, good night, depending on the time zone that you're in. I'm Sarah Krug. I'm a researcher by trade. I'm a patient advocate by choice. I've worked across sectors from cancer research and disease management at Sloan Kettering to varying roles at Pfizer. And I now lead two organizations as founder of the Health Collaboratory, which is a global innovation hub that's built on the foundation of cultivating trust and human-centered participatory design to amplify the voices of the patient, the care partner, the clinician in the co-design of the future of healthcare. I'm also CEO of Cancer 101, which is a patient advocacy organization focused on empowering patients and their families to navigate healthcare in partnership with their healthcare team. Thank you for having me here today.
Melissa.
Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa Dupont from Sanofi. First, I want to just thank everyone and the panelists for taking time out of their day today. I know we're also very busy. I have a number of years of experience working within trial operations, running clinical trials, multinational trials within various therapeutic areas, and then moving into patient engagement, which is my true passion. And now we work directly with patients and individuals with different conditions, and along the way work with different kind of external and internal stakeholders. So thank you for letting me join today.
And last but not least, Whitney.
Hi, Whitney Baldwin. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for those joining. I really appreciate you being here. Whitney Baldwin, I'm with Accenture. I've been with Accenture a little more, almost 10 years now. I lead what we call the Patient Experience Center of Excellence for Accenture, which is nominally a North American function, but actually we engage with our colleagues in Europe as well, because the issues of patients, while maybe a little bit different, there's a lot more commonality than not. One thing, prior to joining Accenture, I spent 20 plus years as a brand commercial guy in various roles, started in consumer packaged goods, consumer health, and then into pharma for J&J and GlaxoSmithKline. And my last role at GSK was actually as the head of what we called our brand reputation initiative, which frankly was trying to take on some of the same issues that we're seeing now. That was quite a while ago that I did that. Unfortunately, some of the same issues are happening right now. It's a little bit of back to the future, so to speak. In my role at Patient Experience Lead, one of the things you'll be seeing and will be sort of a catalyst for the discussion today is a survey that we did to understand the where patients view trust. Now, this is a U.S. only survey, so it didn't have a European component or other markets, but probably have some relevance there. We did this amongst 500 patients in the U.S. across multiple therapeutic areas and representative sample, gender, age, et cetera. And really the question, this was done in December, so this is after the vaccines had started to launch. And so we thought that was a particularly relevant time. And the question we asked was, we define trust as, it's a firm belief in the integrity, the strength, truthfulness, and competency of an organization or someone. And so we wanted a level set on that. And some of the things you'll see, I think not be surprising, but will be illuminating as it relates to this conversation. So looking forward to the dialogue.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah, Melissa, and Whitney for joining us here today. I want to begin by launching a poll for you all to vote on. You should see it pop up in your screen in front of you now. To what extent does your organization prioritize building trust with patients? All the time, to a great extent, somewhat, very little, not at all. And I'm going to leave that open for just a couple of minutes whilst you all get your answers in. But Sarah, I want to come to you first off, and I want to ask a question. What does trust mean as it relates to healthcare?
Thank you for the question, Matt. So trust is one of the most important building blocks in any relationship, whether it's trust in a friend, a partner, a colleague, and even your doctor. But trust is fragile. It takes time to build. It takes seconds to break and an eternity to repair. In the 60s, about 75% of Americans had great confidence in our medical leaders. And unfortunately today, that percent has steeply declined to 34%. And I know that we have a global audience, but in comparison to other developed countries, here in the US, we're less likely to trust our doctors, with about 25% expressing confidence in the health system. We know that a lack of trust can make it less likely for a person to engage in healthy behaviors. It's one of the best predictors of whether a patient will follow a clinician's advice, including screenings. It's trust is the cornerstone of the interactions that a patient has with the healthcare system. And when trust is tarnished, it can lead to fewer patient-doctor interactions. It can lead to a lack of continuity in care, a reduction in the utilization of healthcare services. Mistrust can lead to skepticism and a lack of confidence that the healthcare system cares about me as a patient. And there's a ripple effect to mistrust. It can lead to negative health outcomes, greatly affect medical innovation. It also fuels, it's the fuel to health inequities, right? So there are extensive disparities in trust across socioeconomical and racial lines, and building trust among these vulnerable populations, it's imperative. So we have a lot of work to do as it relates to trust specific to the healthcare space.
Whitney, did you have anything else to add to
that?
Yeah,
I think the thing is, when you put the combination of COVID and the impact across the entire healthcare system, usually things sort of tick along and you'll see sort of hotspots, if you will, but COVID has really transformed the way people feel about their healthcare, and therefore really looking to the healthcare ecosystem. So whether it's doctors, whether it's pharmacies, whether it's pharma, the government, and the delivery of the vaccines really kind of changed the frame and the way that patients both expect what they're going to get from the healthcare system, including pharma. And we're seeing it live right now vis-a-vis the vaccines. What Sarah talked about really is bringing this to the fore is, our ability to overcome this pandemic is largely going to be driven by the fact that we need, herd immunity of 75 to 80% of the population getting vaccinated. But if you look at, as Sarah said, certain populations, including those that have been marginalized, you're really seeing very different attitudes. And that largely is a function of skepticism and trust. And so these are the things that we're trying to sort of unpack. And this is not to say we're going to have the answers, but as you'll see, we did get some responses to what patients are seeing and feeling right now, even in the context of the pharma's, shining example of bringing vaccines in record time, which is fantastic. And as a person of and in the industry, I take great pride in that. However, that can also, be go the other way. We saw a Harris poll in the U.S. that said, versus a year ago, a significant increase in people's positive perception, saying they're doing a good job. And when I did the job on GSK brand reputation, we looked at that metric, and it can move. It can go up, but it can also go down. That's not the same thing as trust. Trust is something, as Sarah said, that's a long-term relationship building thing. So I don't know, Melissa, do you want to build on any of that?
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I mean, even prior to COVID, it's something that's been really important, ensuring that we're building this trust with our patients. And ultimately that comes through communication and education, really ensuring that we're building and sharing, especially in the R&D space, information around clinical trials, decision-making tools for our patients and our participants, really. And again, it's been a long, we're not there yet, and especially with the impact of COVID. But this isn't something that trust didn't start. The issue with trust didn't start with COVID. It was prior to that. And now we're seeing a little bit more of the dialogue around it and ways to address it. So I agree with you.
Thanks, Melissa. All right, I am going to launch our poll results now. And again, you'll see these pop up in front of you. To what extent does your organization prioritize building trust with patients? 25% all the time, to a great extent 40% of the time, somewhat 26%, very little 7%, and not at all 2%. I think those look like pretty positive results to see people are actually, prioritizing this. Is it what you expected to see from the audience, and considering the majority will be from within pharma companies?
I mean, for me, I'm not surprised, because I feel that those that are attending today, this is obviously something very important, important to them, important to your company or wherever you're representing. So I'm not surprised by the results today.
Yeah, I'm pretty encouraged, actually. The hard part is people can say that this is a priority. The real issue, and having been at companies like J&J and GSK, is how does that actually get translated through all parts of the organization? Because if it's not on everybody's mind and a focal point, it's, there are things that can take you sideways, or can, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So this is encouraging, and I think that needs to be sustained. That's going to be something that I will reinforce across the board. The brand reputation initiative we did, and then it kind of, perhaps didn't get the focus following certain things. They feel like the threat's gone or whatever. Well, it's not that it's gone. It's just, it's sort of morphed. And unless you're paying attention, you may miss things.
All right, I am now just going to share my screen and show you a quick slide. And Whitney, I wanted to come to you with a question around this, is what do patients trust? We can see, but who do patients trust most across the healthcare ecosystem? And you can talk to a little bit about the survey and the results here.
Yeah, so this was something that I should be clear. This is, again, amongst patients in the US, 500 patients. And a couple of things to note here. This was something where we asked, who do you trust most? So this is really sort of a torture test, if anybody's done consumer surveys, where you really sort of say, who do you trust most? Not surprisingly, healthcare provider came out the strongest here, 58%. Then pharmacy. I was actually surprised that health insurance came out a little bit better than the pharma industry. So, I'm not, this is not meant to say, I think some people in pharma is like, well, don't they understand we're providing, life-saving medicines? The thing about trust is it's an emotional component. And on the one hand, they may recognize that they know that these are life-saving medicines that they rely on, but at the same time, there's a lot of complex emotions that are going on. And I think you're seeing that in here. It says, yes, even with the vaccines, you're seeing this kind of thing. Does it mean it's all bad? Not necessarily, because you do see things like the Harris poll, and that says they're saying, okay, you're doing a better job, relatively speaking. But it clearly says there's more to do here. And one interesting point is, when we looked among subgroups in the United States for Black and African American patients, which were about 10% of the population, Pharma did a little better, but only because this is a rank ordering. Their trust of healthcare providers was a lot less. So there are dynamics again, and that's based on, I heard a good comment about this the other day from someone at Mount Sinai Medical Center. Said they have sort of an earned skepticism about what's going on. And sorry, I see the line, where do hospitals fall in the trust ball? I would put hospitals under healthcare provider. It's kind of implicit there. But it's usually the person that they've gone to. So there's personal trust there. So this was, you could say it's disheartening in the light of the vaccine delivery. But at the same time, it sort of says this is the reality of where we are. And if you're going to, and you'll see in some of the other results, it's really not just about developing the vaccines. There's other things, other levers that need to be understood and pulled in order to move the needle.
Do you think that when we're looking at this, the health insurance, government, pharmaceutical industry, all at the bottom there, that kind of indicates an overall mistrust with the system itself, and that could be what's what's pushing this mistrust within the industry?
I think, Sarah, maybe you want to touch on that?
Well, I'm sorry, whether insurance companies and pharma being lowest.
And the government, all three at the bottom of that poll, kind of, for me, would indicate that there's a general mistrust of the system itself, and that building trust in the system could be, a key to unlocking trust within pharma as well.
Absolutely. I think there are various layers to this. There are many touch points in healthcare that can tarnish trust. This year, with all the initial confusion around COVID-19, there's been growing mistrust in science and whether it can be influenced, and whether both the good and the bad are truly made transparent. When we talk about influence, it could be government influence, and that's the perception. Mistrust in science can threaten the patient-doctor relationship. Team-based care also has at times led to a lack of connection to any one person on the team as the patient bounces around in a non-coordinated system. We always say that every patient should have an ally on their care team that they can trust in a fragmented system. And sometimes a non-clinician or a non-traditional source of information can be the best place to help build that trust, especially as we move towards this trend of episodic care, where the sacred relationship between the patient and doctor is greatly affected. And it's interesting that healthcare professionals came up at the top of the survey, because I've been entrenched in a Health Confessions research project for a couple of years, where we set out to understand what people might conceal or lie to their doctors about. And we've collected over 5,000 anonymous stories of what people lie to their doctors about. And so we know that even though doctors might be higher on the totem pole in terms of trust, we still have extensive work to do. And then trust in information. So, regardless of sector, trust in information is a growing issue. People don't know where to go for credible information. We live in an era of information overload, and with access to the internet, there's a lot of erroneous information out there to sift through, but most people don't have the skills to distinguish what's credible and what's not. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic and its ripple effect, it's tarnished trust even more with the initial uncertainty and the conflicting information from authoritative sources. So like here in the US, we have the CDC and people were questioning the CDC's motives. And then even now, as data continues to unfold, many are skeptical about how transparent these organizations are with their data. Unfortunately, we're in an industry where a misstep by one organization can affect trust across a particular sector. And so we've been conducting a series of listening sessions, active listening sessions, I should say, with patients to understand what they're hearing, what they're reading, and what's that influence on the cascade of decisions that they make. There's also extensive skepticism as it relates to who's monitoring the data and how it's being monitored, with Big Brother always watching. Technology's outpacing security, privacy, reliability, and that can have a major impact on trust, because oftentimes there's a lack of transparency in how information's being collected, protected, shared. And transparency goes above and beyond tucking legal terms that no one can understand in the terms and conditions and the privacy policies. So in our work with patients, we also have them access the terms and conditions of various interventions. And on average, 90% of what they read, they don't understand. I could talk about this topic all day, as you could tell.
Well, I was curious, Melissa, when you saw these results, were you, disheartened, or what was the reaction? Do you think people in your organization would be surprised, or what do you think the reaction would be?
So, when we primarily work with patients, right? So we gain insights to help build our clinical trials, right? Really giving our patients a seat at the table. And when we talk to them around where do they get their information, and when they make a decision to participate in a clinical trial or to try a drug treatment, they always say their doctor, right? And quite often, even if they think that they want to try something else, if their doctor says, no, we don't recommend it, they won't try it, because they really put a lot of trust in their doctor. And they also put a lot of trust in their external partnerships, like their caregivers or their family members, or what they see in the community, like the patient advocacy groups. So I'm not surprised that health providers are number one. And I think when I think about health insurance, it's probably because they can talk to somebody, they can get to somebody to ask a question. Where in the pharmaceutical industry, it's hard to maybe for a patient to talk to somebody, because we do have policies and privacy laws in place, right? So while I would like to see it a little more evenly spread, I'm not surprised that the healthcare providers are definitely number one.
And just to interject, then the sad reality is that a lot of clinicians don't necessarily always recommend a clinical trial as a care option. That is a trusted source. They're also driven by incentives. So it's just, there's a whole ripple effect.
Yeah, it is. And I agree with you, Sarah. We see it quite often where a patient will tell us that their doctors flat out told them, no, we don't recommend, you're going to stay this course. We don't recommend you go to a trial, or we don't want you to refer you to another doctor, right? Because especially with COVID, right? They're limited to see a lot of their patients. Absolutely. So they don't really want them going outside. So we are seeing this when we talk to them to try to figure out how are they making a decision and who do they trust to participate.
I am going to show you another slide now. So you should see that come up in front of you. And Sarah, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this, and how is mistrust impacting healthcare?
Yeah, I think, so maybe I'll just, so this is from the survey, Sarah, so let me just jump in, then you can comment.
Okay.
We asked, how has this experience affected you? Now, implicitly, vaccines and, the whole delivery of that and the speed was part of this. I think the good news is it showed there was an increase in trust. So if you look at significantly, moderately, that's about, 35%. 45% no change. But then there are others for whom, the issues you cited, it actually kind of went the other way. So net, there was, I call a modest increase in trust. And while that's good news, it to me, what it said and the way I interpreted was, I think many in pharma would say, well, we developed these vaccines, we're saving lives, we're here, we did it in record speed. Why don't you give us credit? And the reality was that they are giving a bit of credit, but they see it as kind of, that's your job. That's your job to develop the medicines. And frankly, they would probably look and say, well, that's why you earn so much money, is because of that's your job. So we're not going to give you extra credit for that. And as a matter of fact, we saw sort of, it also changed their expectations to say, in terms of the R&D process, it's like they actually said, well, that's great, but what about my condition? What do I, where's the same urgency for my situation? Can't you show that there? So, their expectations have changed dramatically, and this is evidence that there's some good news, but it can't just be only about the medicines. There has to be other things. So Sarah, I don't know if you want to add in.
Yeah, so as Whitney mentioned, despite the fact that we're in the midst of a debilitating pandemic that's disrupted our lives substantially, there is widespread distrust in R&D efforts around COVID-19. And it's 34% of Americans said that they're likely not going to get a COVID-19 vaccine as per a study. And those numbers jump to about 49% in Blacks, even though they're one of the hardest hit by the pandemic. The majority of Blacks do have low levels of trust in the healthcare system in general. And as per a recent Kaiser study, 7 out of 10 Blacks said that the healthcare system treats people unfairly based on race often. And that's a substantial increase from when that similar question was asked about 20 years ago. There was another study that came out, I believe it was last Friday, that showed that even US healthcare workers were skeptical about COVID-19 vaccines. So approximately 15% of American frontline healthcare workers have not been vaccinated for COVID-19, even though they've been among the first eligible to receive the treatment in those communities. And then shifting away from all things COVID related, just as it relates to mistrust in healthcare in general, in the LGBTQ community, for instance, a lack of trust in healthcare has led to many avoiding, delaying their care and visits to the doctor. The LGBT community often negotiates whether they should disclose their sexual orientation and gender identity status to their clinicians based on how safe they feel during the visit. And these patients are affected by a healthcare system that can be discriminatory, makes assumptions, lacks cultural sensitivity, and mistrust makes patients less likely to follow medical advice from their clinician and stick to a treatment plan. It's affecting the utilization of digital health, where, as I mentioned earlier, people are skeptical about how their privacy will be maintained. And then let's not forget about the impact on innovation and research. We know that clinical trial participants should reflect the diversity of our population, with a particular emphasis on including the type of people most affected by a particular disease. But there's significant imbalance in representation of various ethnicities and race in research. And then this lack of diversity can lead to the development of innovations that haven't translated well into real world use. And I understand that there are various efforts underway to address these issues, and that's great, recognizing that trust building, it has to be part of the strategy.
Melissa, have you sort of seen similar, do the results surprise you? Have you seen sort of similar growth in trust or sort of no change within Sanofi and what you've been, or at least over the last year?
So what we've done here is we continue to work at warp speed. Even we were able to complete, to help build trust, we were able to continue our clinical trials, right? During COVID, we didn't stop any of our clinical trials. So in a way, it forced us in pharma to accelerate a little bit of innovation, meaning we found a way to get our treatments to patients, right? We found a way to quickly do virtual health visits that maybe we were slow to adopt earlier. We were able to ship meds directly to our patients' homes and things like that without interruption. So for me, I think that's a way that we're trying to continue to build trust in our patients and in clinical trials. So I think it's something that we've been trying to do prior to COVID-19.
But just to build on Melissa's comment, I think it's a really important point. You know, we did other research about patients, the impact of COVID, and you saw a dramatic increase in things like telehealth, and we all have seen, you know, this kind of thing. And I think what we saw was that people who had experienced telehealth or televisits actually had a really positive view. And they, not for every condition, but they said, you know, frankly, it was as good or, you know, better than their prior healthcare experience. And I think the broader picture is much of the healthcare ecosystem, including pharma, recognizing there are, you know, some restrictions, it takes a lot of work for a patient. They have to do all the work be their own ambassador, to go towards the system, if you will. In this instance, it was the first time ever, it kind of went the other way, that the entire healthcare ecosystem, pharma, provider networks, patients weren't coming in, so they had to go towards them in much more tangible ways. And I think that's a fundamental shift. I mean, I don't think doctors ever thought that the patients wouldn't be coming in. You know, that just never occurred to them. So I think they realized they too had to do things differently. So to your point, whether it was in a clinical trial space to evolve to more digital enablement that allowed them to do things from the home, we see a lot of that, but also in the commercial space, it's a real recognition that it's not just about the doctor. It is, in fact, that, you know, having a balanced approach with a patient as well as HCP focus, that's become, I think, much more apparent to people. It's not that it wasn't there, it's just the level of the intensity, if you will.
Yeah, and I just want to also recognize Sarah's point and the importance of really making sure that we're able to get into our patient communities, right? Making sure that we can find a way to treat everyone, especially with clinical trials, right? Because we want to make sure that we're treating the patients that are going to we're studying and having them participate in our clinical trials that are actually going to be prescribed in the real world, right? So that's really important for the health value, for the outcomes, and in ensuring that. And I think in a positive way with COVID-19 is we're finding ways to expand that, right? To find ways to really go right into the community. And we're learning this. So I hope that we can continue to see an uptick around the communication, the education, and I know we'll talk about it in a little bit, really to help build that trust and move that needle up.
And who would have thought that decentralized clinical trials would have blossomed the way it did?
Right. Yeah, we've been talking about it for years, right? In this industry, pushing it. And, you know, it took the pandemic really to amplify and accelerate it.
I would like to come to our second poll now, and you should see these results come up in front of you again. What do you believe are the biggest barriers to earning patients' trust? Unfairly high drug prices, a need for greater transparency in product development, clinical trials, lack of patient assistance and educational resources, incorporating patient perspective throughout product lifecycle, and other. If you don't see your answer there, but you would like to contribute, please pop your answer in the chat function at the bottom of the screen. And again, we'll leave that open for just a moment, but I want to come again to our panelists and ask you, why should pharma care about distrust? And we can kind of comment on the audience answers in a second, but in the first instance, I'd be interested to hear, you know, why should you care?
Yeah, so I'll chime in. So one of the silver linings, if the only silver lining that came out of 2020, is that the term clinical trial became a household name. It was the first time that many had been introduced to the world of clinical trials thanks to the media. Every media outlet was talking about the innovation race to the cure, right? It was the first time people understood they could potentially be part of saving the world. But things like the use of words, Operation Warp Speed, they didn't help, right? So Operation Warp Speed means rapid speed, faster than the speed of light. And it's a term that originated in science fiction and actually became popular through Star Trek. And we do extensive work in the words that cause confusion amongst patients. And one of our assessments showed that the term Operation Warp Speed actually led to low confidence in the COVID-19 vaccine because no one wants to be part of anything that potentially seems rushed. connection to science fiction, it isn't reassuring. So something as simple as the label of this operation may have influenced a person's decision to get the COVID-19 vaccine. And there were also many patients who had ailments and Whitney alluded to this a minute ago, but those in the rare disease community, for instance, they question motivations. Every company is chasing the cure because of how many people have COVID-19, and they came up with multiple treatments in record speed. What about me and my disease? All I ever hear is an average of 17 years from bench to bedside. This led to people questioning underlying motivations. So it's definitely an opportunity to provide more context and information to ensure this doesn't turn into a dark cloud over time. And there is a return on investment to trust, right? We've been working with patients over the years to conduct trust assessments to measure how the words we use, the actions that we take, the deliverables that we launch, and the interactions that we have affect trust across organizations and sectors across healthcare. So until we recognize that there's a return on value to trust, and that's embedded in the strategy, we're not going to be able to move the needle.
I am going to end the poll now and share these results. So 14% said unfairly high drug prices, 26% said a need for greater transparency in product development and clinical trials, lack of patient assistance and educational resources had 25%, and the highest was at 29%, incorporating patient perspective throughout the product life cycle. But we have had a number of answers come through in the chat box, and I want to read these out as well. Patient-centric healthcare rather than media-centric healthcare. Policy and regulations make it harder. Biggest barrier is the media, including scaremongering, fake news, and politicizing healthcare. Most people still think of clinical trials as being a guinea pig in some experiment. The perceived high prices of innovation and the rhetoric of academia and bureaucrats, the complicated chain of pharmaceuticals, distributors, insurers, so the system itself, again, the system itself, education, and a couple of other answers sort of reiterating the ones we've seen and heard here. Melissa, from an internal perspective, does that sort of align with what you would have expected?
Yeah, I was curious to see. I think what I thought was going to be one of the number ones actually ended up being the top three. For me, patient perspectives is obviously number one. That's what I do every day. And we do work across the life cycle, right? So we work in early development, making sure we talk with people and different individuals globally that might be living with a certain disease or condition to really get an understanding around their disease experience first. And then as we move into clinical trials, making sure that it's relevant for them. Do we have meaningful patient outcomes, right? Not just something that we think the FDA or EMA is going to approve, but something that's meaningful for patients as well. And then taking that into regulatory and commercial as well, taking that information that we've learned early on and continue to build upon it. And it also helps in decision making and understanding real world, like what's a burden to participate in a clinical trial, and then what's the burden going to be in the real world if I have to take a medication 3 times a day, once a day, orally, like in an injectable, things like that. What's the impact on that in symptoms and safety? So the patient perspective is extremely important. And with that, it kind of goes into the number 2 answer, right? Around patient education and transparency. That's key. We need to make sure that we're partnering with our advocacy groups and our hospitals to making sure that we're sharing enough information around clinical trials that's easy to understand. And I know that we have lay summaries that are shared after a clinical trial is over. So instead of someone trying to read a medical journal or something like that, we have a clinical study report for our patients and our participants that's written in some easy to understand language. So that's an example of that.
And there's a business imperative to caring about trust, isn't there, as well? It's not just, obviously, the end goal is better health outcomes there's no question in that, but within that is high rates of patient adherence, and embedding, trust and that patient perspective and strategy does lead to better business results.
Sarah mentioned that earlier. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in, but Sarah had mentioned that in the beginning, how important trust is, especially to not only having adherence to someone's medication, but to seeing their doctors regularly, to making sure that they're following up with other external resources to help them. Maybe it's not just their doctor, maybe it's something like a social worker or someone like that, to build that circle to help a patient advocate for themselves to continue to be better. And Whitney, I'm sorry, I'll let you jump in.
No, I agree. And I think there's a couple of things. One is this notion of, well, pharma, we have regulations. I've been in a long time, and yes, there are regulations, but there are regulations in other industries. And as we saw in COVID, FDA can evolve. You just have to figure out a way to help them understand what you're trying to do can actually have a positive outcome on patient perception and ultimately outcomes. And there's examples where that's happened. So I don't fully accept the sort of, well, we're regulated kind of thing. I think that, we've got to test ourselves as an industry. And I think, going to your area of clinical trials, the stats around clinical trials are pretty appalling in terms of 5 to 10% of the eligible population don't participate, aren't even aware. So, and then when you look at the numbers that actually enroll and then, are part of a trial, there's a business impact, and trust is implicit in some of those numbers, as well as on the commercial side, the issue of adherence. People kind of have this view, well, you just wanted me to stay on your medicines. And I think it's the way we communicate and how we engage that's really interfering with it. And I don't think pharma, frankly, focuses to the degree that they should on those types of things. And it can have a positive human outcome and business outcome.
Melissa, we've got an audience question here, and I want to ask to you, because I think it relates to sort of your line of work. And it says, do not underestimate the caregiving relatives of patient, when it comes to trust. They deal with the situation together. So how about finding a way to include this as well in clinical studies? It would help create togetherness as a catalyzing factor to improve trust. Is it something you guys try to include as that caregiver within studies and so on?
We do, actually. I actually have a caregiver interview next week with 2 caregivers. And we are trying to find ways to incorporate that. And it's not just in the clinical design. We're also trying to find ways to support. How do we help support caregivers globally, right? Because they might be the ones that have to drive the patient to participate in a trial that's outside maybe their standard norm, right? And also, what's the impact of the caregiver just within a disease itself, right? So how does it impact how they care for their loved one? But not only that, but how is it affecting them and their own health as well? So there's a lot of things that we're looking into. I mean, we've only just tapped the surface of this, but it's definitely a very important thing. And it not only impacts the patient and their decision making, but also impacts the caregiver as well in their life.
I am going to share my screen again in just a second. But the question I'm going to ask and get you all to respond to is, what actions can pharma take to earn patients' trust? And again, we're going to see some results from the Accenture survey. Those should be up in front of you now. What actions can pharma take to earn patients' trust? Lowered drug prices, 83%. I'll just read the first couple of ones at the top there. Publicly shared clinical research data in a clear and transparent manner, 82% financially supported access to treatment, 78% provided more educational resources to patients, 75% and supported government policies protecting patients' rights and health at 74%. I might just leave that open to our panelists and allow somebody to jump in, but what are your thoughts on those results?
Yeah, I mean, when we saw this, first of all, the lower drug prices, not surprised. That's always going to come up. Historically, has come up. That's probably not something that's going to be, hit upon, but it is a pain point. But what's more important is, if you look across the board, it's not just about, developing more medicines, although that's certainly sort of, as I said, table stakes. if you look at this, this is both in the R&D segment, sector, as well as the commercial sector, all these things that are there. And it's not that pharma isn't doing them. They can point to, I look at some of the things, whether it's patient assistance or education, there are efforts there, but it's frankly, patients aren't aware of them. And there's not enough attention focused on, for example, financial as well as other types of support that can be, that are needed now, particularly in this time of COVID. Things like sharing clinical trial transparency. We think we do it, but again, when I look at some of the portals that are about the clinical trials, frankly, I wouldn't call them particularly patient-centric. So I think this is this whole issue of there's more than just the focus around medicines, if you will, and these are multi-pronged, track types of things that pharma, I think, can and should elevate and do differently and better. And if done in an appropriate way, I think patients would respond. We have other research that says things like patient services, they value them if they're approached in the right way. So I think that's, it's some of this, so you would say, is expected, but some of it is say it's going beyond the medicine. These are trust value levers is the way I look at it.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in. And many people have heard me say this often, it's become my motto, but transparency is the most disruptive innovation of the 21st century. But I think we have a lot of work to do in this regard. It's great to see that data sharing has become an imperative for many, but we also need to take it one step further and ensure that people can understand what that data means within the context of their lives. It's up to us to translate healthcare speak. For many, healthcare is like a foreign flick, and we need to provide the subtitles, right? There's been a transformational shift to partner with the experts by experience, the patients across healthcare. And as we recognize that the life expertise of the person with the disease is an invaluable resource that can help clarify a patient's priorities, their needs, long before we embark upon discovery, it's important we carve out safe spaces to integrate the voice of vulnerable populations that are typically not heard, which has been the focus of our work with patients. And then lastly, I think in order for the pharmaceutical industry to evolve from that perception that they're just a drug manufacturer to the perception that they're a healthcare company focused on health and well-being, they're going to need to do more as it relates to investing in people's health before, during, and after they're ill, right? Patient support services that extend into prevention. And as Melissa mentioned, caregiver support. And I'm sure many here in the US have heard, not to make light of this, but Krispy Kreme is offering free donuts to people until the end of the year if they get vaccinated. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's a donut a day. I haven't had a Krispy Kreme since college, so I'm not 100% certain, but donuts are obviously not the healthiest option, right? Obesity, it complicates, there are complications with COVID-19, but we won't go there. But sadly, many patients have asked if pharma was funding that campaign. But what if pharma did something radical, right? And partnered with a wellness company, and with each vaccine gave out a free gym membership, or a gift card where you could only purchase healthy foods based on the SKUs, or something that demonstrated that pharma is concerned about people before, during, and after they're ill, right? And it infuriates me because I worked for pharma for a decade. We did great work. All of you are doing phenomenal work, but it's not reaching the average person affected by a condition. And so there needs to be more transparency, even about all these wonderful things that you are doing, because you're not just all about the medication, but sometimes these patients don't see that. So it's imperative that we shift our mindsets from how do we convince people to trust us to how do we become more trustworthy over time.
Yeah, so Sarah, I really just want to jump in on that a little bit, because I really wanted to share an example of something like that, at least on the R&D side, right? So we had an opportunity in working with Susan G. Komen to actually go into an urban hospital with non-native English speaking patients. They were just newly diagnosed with breast cancer. And we really just wanted to sit and talk with them around their new diagnosis, their feelings, if they were to participate in a clinical trial, showing them a study design, talking to them about assessments. We did all of this with a nurse interpreter, right there in the hospital at a round table. And they expressed huge fears around a biopsy, around a punch biopsy that was to be done right at the beginning of the study. saying that they were newly diagnosed and they had this fear that punching my skin might spread the cancer. It was a tremendous fear, and it was acknowledged. We're able to go back to the clinical team, share this, and actually have it removed from the design itself. And that's why it's so important to make sure that we're going in, talking to our patients and figuring things out early on to understand, and making sure we're not just sitting at a round table with one type of patient advocates that talk every day and understand clinical trials, that we're going to all the communities, right, and learning. And that was something that quite amazing, I think. And I just wanted to share that those are opportunities that we can continue to try to leverage. Obviously, this was pre-COVID, so we have to get creative on how to do that. But I would like to see that continue.
Yeah, that's a great example, Melissa.
Terrific example. I mean, what struck me is like, well, that's irrational. Well, yeah, but that's where they are. So, go towards them, help them see that you use the word acknowledge. That's a fundamental word that I think is kind of skipped over. And so I think that acknowledgement, and then saying, no, we're going to change things a little bit. That's the type of small yet large change that I think can and should happen.
Right. And Whitney, I just want to be careful. And I see a comment come up about the irrational. I mean, I don't want to say that was an irrational fear. I haven't been newly diagnosed with breast cancer. That's a genuine fear from a patient population, right? And we were able to bring it back to our scientists, and they were able to find a way to say, we don't need this. We don't need to collect this. This isn't a data piece that we need. We can get it another way to support the design, to support the clinical trial. And so then we were able to acknowledge worry and fear, and that goes into trust, right?
Yeah, sorry, I should be clear.
Yeah.
I wasn't saying making a judgment on them. I could see how some of the
Yeah.
clinical folks could view it that way.
Exactly.
So apologies if
Yeah,
I
no, and it was an aha, an educational moment for sure for our clinical team, because they didn't even think that would be a problem, right?
And that's a great way to really build that trust, is account for the emotional journey that patient goes through and the caregiver goes through, as you're also mapping that patient journey, if you will. So I love that, you're really taking that into account.
And it's also about removing assumptions through a lot of this process, isn't it? Education is the greatest example. So, using plain language on when you're speaking to a patient, and removing the assumption that they're going to know that this means that, or they're going to be, know the pharmaceutical lingo, because we work in a pretty complicated system, and that's for us who work in it. And so for those who are not part of it, can be removing the assumption to communicate is vital, I think.
Yeah, and I think with some of this, we don't really want everyone to go into Google, right, to find those answers. I think if we can anticipate the questions up front and give the answers in advance that are clear and easy to understand, it'll help going down that rabbit hole of Google, and that's where you see all of the misinformation as well.
Yeah, and it's not even just the pharmaceutical terms, as Matt mentioned, right? Our words assessment showed that term negative, which I think most of us understand, causes confusion, because a negative test can mean a bad thing to a patient, but in healthcare terms, it's actually a good thing. And so the simple words that we're using to convey things to patients, the way in which we're conveying it, right? So we all also take in information differently. So for instance, I'm a linguistic learner. I think I'm the only person that when I watch a TED Talk, I watch the first minute on video, and then if there's a script, I read the remainder, because I like to take in information by reading it. Some people are visual, some are auditory. And so we also have to recognize that as we're providing data, as we're providing information, we can't do it in a one-size-fits-all manner. We really have to tailor it based on how people take in information and can act upon that information over time.
I fully agree. That's actually been one of my platforms in fighting spots all the time, that making sure that if we're sharing information or if a patient's participating in something, we have to understand everyone learns differently, right? So providing a visual tool, a written tool, and maybe even something else, sit down and have like a team trainer. There's all different ways.
That's great.
We have 5 minutes left, so I want to ask the audience a question now, and I'm going to give you the opportunity to please answer this in the chat box. So free form, send your answers through thick and fast. So what is one step you can take to help build trust, and what is the biggest barrier to succeeding? And I want to ask the panelists to close up in these last 5 minutes. What is the one thing you'd like to see happen in healthcare or in pharma related to trust? And I am going to start with Sarah, please.
I'll go back to the statement I made earlier about transparency being the most disruptive innovation of the 21st century. So let's start sharing more data in a way that people can understand so that over time we can rebuild that trust.
Melissa?
For me, I think you've all learned is really just that relationship building, that education, and really making sure we're going into the right patient communities, right? That's going to be something that's key, and making sure that we're meeting all of our patients where they're at. We've proven that we can do it, so let's try to continue that and try to keep up that momentum. That's for me really important, and I think also, like Sarah said, the transparency, and I think that goes along with the education and relationship building.
Yeah, for me, I think the key thing that I keep coming away with, and a lot of the comments there, is the history of pharma is, science, and it's talking about some of the things that Melissa said about, the science and talking to doctors, very rational. But as in my experience, healthcare is largely emotional because people feel vulnerable, et cetera. And they're already dealing with a condition that they don't want to have. So instead of it being about sort of a, clinical and medical orientation, can't we make it not even patient-centric, human-centric? And the human-centric concept goes beyond sort of the physiological needs, and recognize that for patients, the way we treat them sometimes is we're talking about their, for lack of a better word, their treatment journey. And that's sort of the focus. They look at their lives, their condition in the context of their life journey. So how we appropriately connecting and going towards them to understand where that life journey is, where it makes sense for us to play, and doing it consistently over time. This has historically been when we feel threatened as an industry versus saying, how are we going to establish a, quote, relationship in an appropriate way where they want us and where they see value? That will pay dividends for us, in my view, as an industry. And the trust can rebuild, but it has to be done consistently and over time.
Interesting, because the relationship between pharma and the patient, it has an intermediary in terms of, that HCP. And so I have a question here from Todd, and it's probably got a couple more minutes left. So he says, how can we improve level of trust HCPs have for education and research coming from pharma? And do you think improving this metric in the pharma HCP relationship would trickle down and positively impact patient trust with pharma? What are your thoughts? I can see some nodding heads.
Yeah, so I can actually give you some good examples. I agree, and I know that I'm working within the MS space. We have a consortium kind of around this piece, making sure that we're sharing HCP education, and also making sure that our HCPs are representative of the patient population. So I think it's important as well to continue to educate and have that information for our HCPs and for their staff as well.
Well, and technically, medical education for clinicians, there's a whole governance structure here in the US to ensure that it's fair, balanced, unbiased. It's been peer reviewed, things of that sort. So the HCP education, I'm typically less concerned about. The patient side, it's a little bit of the wild west. It's not governed, but I'm working on that. So if anyone wants to join me in that effort, ping me.
Well, I think it's about enabling the language piece between the two of them, because there's a disconnect, and there's plenty of data around that, I think, as you have cited, Sarah. So for me, it's about, we're not just saying it's all about the patient. Obviously, it's got to be that, how can pharma enable that dialogue in a different way so both feel like they're enhancing their own relationship, and pharma can be a facilitator of that.
And I think it's important for patients to also start recognizing the expertise we all bring to the table, right? So pharma sits on so much science, so much data, and I don't know any other entity that has that much. You have that bird's eye view as it relates to everything that's going on, and until we start to shed more light on the strengths and weaknesses we all bring to the table, we're not going to be able to move that needle. But I think it's imperative we put more of a spotlight on that, because we all have an important role to play in improving health outcomes over time.
Yeah, and I agree. I do want to just highlight really quickly, I've been seeing some of the chats roll up, and at the end of the day, we really just need to make sure our patients, our patient advocacy groups really have a seat at that table, right? In some of this key decision making. And as we're spitting out tools, we didn't just create them, we're making sure our patients are reviewing them too, and that they make sense. So I fully agree with a lot of those comments that have come up, and I want to thank you for recognizing that.
Well, unfortunately, that is the end of our time. How time flies. Sarah, Melissa, Whitney, I really want to appreciate, thank you for your time today, especially Accenture, who have been our partner in putting this webinar together. If you want to learn a little bit more about some of the work they're doing, or learn about the results from their research, you can go to accenture.com/patient-xlab, or reach out to Whitney at whitney.baldwin@accenture.com. And I'm sure if you had any more questions, you'd be able to find all our speakers on LinkedIn, and feel free to connect with them. I hope they don't mind me saying. Look, again, thank you so much for your time today. I hope you've learned a lot. And until next time, thanks, and have a nice day.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Take care. Bye.